Back in 2016, one of the greatest and most exciting game showcases of all time, Sony's E3 conference for that year, showed off a huge new game from the Bend studio that brought us all beloved classics such as Siphon Filter, Uncharted Golden Abyss, and best of all, Bubsy 3D. Everyone was pretty excited, hoping this new zombie game would be just as good as Last of Us. It didn't go without its fair share of concerns around the quality of the game, but it seemed there was still a huge amount of hype. Once it was released in 2019, though, it was met with shockingly low scores from nearly every critic imaginable, and seemed to be one of Sony's biggest failures of the current era. On the other hand, many loyal fans still love the game to this day, and many absolutely adore it and really want a sequel to continue the story. But which one of them is correct? Is this a disappointing mess, or a hidden beauty that was misunderstood? Let's find out. This is Days Gone. Days Gone is perhaps one of the most fascinating recent PlayStation exclusives. It's not because it was an insanely different type of game, a game that revolutionized how we view the world of gaming, or a game that everyone fell in love with, but rather because it was none of those. You see, with most modern PlayStation exclusives, they're met with massive amounts of love and adoration from critics and fans alike. They almost always get awards up the wazoo, are credited with enormous mechanical innovations, and receive masterpiece scores from all the big gaming publications. Days Gone didn't get any of this. It wasn't a huge innovation, let's face it. It was met with mediocre to bad scores from most large reviews, and I didn't see it up for any major awards. So what sets Days Gone apart is not the fact that it's a good game, but that many saw it as a bad game, which is very uncommon for these sorts of exclusives. It's pretty unique in many ways and was recognized by a lot of fans as a great game, but it was still commonly known as the PlayStation game that failed to impress, which made me really concerned when I first played it last October. I'm going to spare you all the details of my first impressions with the game and just cut to the chase. By the time I was done playing it through and through and even getting the Platinum Trophy after 5 extra hours of grinding for the dumb corpse looting trophy, I thought the game was good. That's pretty much it. I thought it was a good game, not mediocre, not bad, and certainly not terrible. I had a lot of problems with it, but I still found it to be one of the most addictive games I had ever played, and I really appreciated how fun it was for open world lovers such as myself. Did I feel the same way after playing it once again? Well, I suppose you'll find out. One of the first things that immediately stuck out to me was how absolutely weird the graphics made me feel. These visuals are gorgeous, but they also feel like they're made of glass. You will find a ton of diverse locations all over the open world map, with absolutely stunning vistas, trees that are graciously grazed by the wind, amazing sunrises and sunsets that are preferable to watching an actual sunset, and very well done character model animations. The whole world feels very alive and pretty, and if this were taking place without any of the freakers or marauders that terrorize the player, this would be the prettiest life simulator of all time. The problem is that many people don't want to pay attention to these visuals because they're too busy trying not to be eaten alive by every single goddamn thing in Oregon. Well, except the Gobblewonker. This seriously is commendable, though. Bend Studios should at least be proud of how darn pretty they've made their home state look in this game, especially considering that they had access to less resources than many of Sony's larger studios. The game never really looks bad, and there are tons of really cool and unique designs for enemies and heroes alike, which keeps each character and type of freaker more memorable and recognizable. The frame rate also almost never dips in my experience. You'd think that a game which puts you up against massive zombie hordes, and has you drive a motorbike through an insanely rich environment would constantly be dropping in terms of performance, but you'd be wrong. They did an amazing job making this game run well. Like, holy crap, this is smooth, especially on PS5 with 60 FPS. It's a very comfortable experience that has never crashed or broken down for me a single time. The game looks great and runs great, so what's the catch? Why did I just say that I feel like it's made of glass? Well, that might be because of this game's biggest problem: the absolutely insane amount of glitches. This game was slandered constantly for being released in what many considered an unfinished, broken state. I'm not going to deny it one bit. This game has a ton of glitches. It's kind of a mess as well. I will agree with the critics on that. Like I said, none of these really destroy the game or completely ruin your experience. They are just major examples of a lack of polish. An enemy that maybe jerks around, stops moving, or falls through an object. A character that suddenly stops appearing or teleports during a cutscene, or a texture that doesn't come in correctly, or an enemy corpse hilariously falling down a hill. These are all things that you need to expect in Days Gone, no matter how many updates you've downloaded. These problems will remain always and forever within the game, it seems. And that's really what, in my opinion, made Days Gone so hated. Sony games always have to live up to a near impossible standard of polish and refinement, so when there's one thing that people didn't find perfect, the game is slammed and attacked relentlessly. A lot of these glitches are very minor, and they don't make the game a whole lot worse, but it is a major problem with the game. They spent all their time on making a beautiful game that runs perfectly, and didn't pay enough attention to ironing out those stupid little errors that make the game less professional. That's the problem. And don't get me wrong, this is not at all proper justification to name the game awful or bad. In fact, if you do that, you're just being flat out unfair. I'm just saying that I'm not willing to give a title of masterpiece to a game with this many weird physics errors and bugs that could have been fixed with just a few more months of development. It is interesting though, because I haven't seen much criticism for those who hate this game on any subject outside of the glitches. So is the game completely perfect otherwise? Well, sadly no, but why? Well, a major thing this game does a great and bad job of at the same time is gameplay. The gameplay of Days Gone originally seemed very derivative and uncreative to me. I drew a very clear line between its gameplay and that of Horizon and Last of Us. I thought of it as fun but extremely unoriginal, which would have dipped the score quite a bit, though after replaying the game I have grown a new appreciation of this gameplay style, and I better recognize the ways it differentiates itself from other open world games. Of course I have to mention the bike, the game's most touted feature, and it is certainly a motorcycle. It's funny because the mechanics around this bike are not very creative and innovative, but the simple fact it exists and works so damn well for what it is gives it a pass. I have never played an open world game that relies on vehicle transport that functions, controls, and responds so well to your every movement. It's crazy. The bike is so smooth, super fun to use, and absolutely awesome. Through the game it is literally your ride or die, and the developers never forget this. If you want to leave your bike behind, go ahead, but you're going to be 100% screwed. This bike is an extremely helpful feature that will make or break your survival during the apocalypse, and without it, the game would probably be terrible. The open world map is so much easier and more satisfying to explore with this thing, and I think if they do make a sequel, there's a lot of awesome, slightly unrealistic stuff they could do with the bike to make this one of the greatest open world games ever, and even compete with Spider-Man in terms of movement. But for now, it's just a really solid general foundation for later. And that's what much of Days Gone's gameplay feels like. A very fun and well done building block for something amazing. The shooting is really satisfying and works well, but feels overall empty and way too basic for the modern era. The hordes are absolutely amazing, but every single one of them is pretty much the exact same, so it gets a little stale when you're hunting them down. The melee has some really good ideas, but is pretty useless and clunky in the end. And of course, the stealth is a great tool which boosts the survivalist nature of the game, but ends up falling completely flat in every conceivable way. If I had to pick the second worst thing this game does as a game, that would definitely be the stealth, which is so basic, boring, and useless, and repetitive that it shouldn't even be part of the game. It really stretches that title of building block because this is so basic and derivative that it feels like they just slapped it together within a week to put a bullet point on the back of the box. The other aspects, which I will talk about next, at least remain mostly useful through the course of the campaign and have one or two fun ideas that make things more exciting, but the stealth there is nothing more than walking up behind a guy and pressing triangle. Sure, you have the annoying as hell traps that suck and are only used sparsely during ambush camps, the silencers on weapons that every other game already has, but that suck here because they're way too powerful, and the different stealth animations, but that's far from enough to make me care. Stealth in games like Horizon, Last of Us, and Spider-Man vary in terms of how many mechanics they add, of course, but they all at least have some reason to use the stealth. Outside of story missions where you're absolutely forced to use stealth, Days Gone doesn't really make it an important asset and a priority in combat after the first 2 hours of gameplay. In Last of Us, on the other side of the spectrum, stealth is a hugely important mechanic that you need to use to survive. If you get caught, you can still fight off to survive in the normal way, but you really have to use stealth if you want to get through many of these encounters. It's a perfect balance. Here, stealth just feels like something you're allowed to do, but not at all necessary. It really is a huge disappointment for a game that really pushes a survivalist tone like Last of Us does. I think it ends up somewhat succeeding with that tone by having an open world combined with hunting and gathering and all the mechanics involving gathering sparse resources, but the stealth is a huge problem for Days Gone nevertheless. Now next up, we will put the melee on trial and see if it's good. Who am I kidding? It's not. The melee in this game is kinda bad, to be honest. It doesn't work very well, is the largest catalyst for glitches out of any mechanic in here, and really becomes kind of annoying as the game goes on. Unlike stealth, melee is actually useful for quite a long time, and I'd say it saved my skins quite often for around 2/3 of the game, which is great, but then there's the third it didn't help with. Now, you must keep in mind, Days Gone is about 50 hours long, give or take, to beat. So a third of that is still a long goddamn time. So the fact that the melee becomes very boring and useless during the final stretch is still a big problem, and is an example of pretty poor design in my opinion. You have to roll to dodge away from attacks, which takes quite a lot of stamina away, so you really have to use it sparingly. You also have tons of weapons you can craft and different options based on what you have in your inventory and what you first picked up, which is really cool. Outside of those two mechanics, though, the melee is just another thing in the game that doesn't innovate much from other similar games and feels pretty incomplete. They really needed some more unique mechanics to truly make this a great system, just like with the final piece of this combat trifecta, the gunplay. The way you use your guns in this game is not like anything I've ever seen. Just kidding, it's very similar to pretty much any other shooter out there. There's barely anything original here, and though the shooting is very useful, very polished, and certainly very fun, it really feels like a copy and pasted knockoff of any other game in this genre from recent years. While the melee is pretty boring and not very useful but adds quite a few original concepts, the shooting is completely unoriginal but very fun, very necessary, and well made. So you end up having different systems with different strengths and flaws, and though they're weak by themselves, don't take this part of the review as me saying the gameplay sucks, because once again, it is super fun and mostly well made, just lacks a lot of originality in the combat. On the other hand, the exploration and side content is amazing. You have a ton of bang for your buck here with tons of varying forms of collectibles and activities that you can go through in a really satisfying way. Every single one of these are different and fun in their own ways. The Nero checkpoints might be my favorite, with how you have to secure the whole building and make sure alarms don't attract swarms of zombies, and then find a way to restore power that gets more and more difficult as the game goes on. And once you finally get into the MMU, the reward is some sweet, sweet vaccination that gives you more health, stamina, or focus. The ambush camps are fun little combat challenges that are very well designed and help to expose more of the map over time. It's really fun to go through these, as are the hordes, camp jobs, and every other bit of side content out there. Ben's studio did a commendable job connecting everything together in the open world to make it a far better open world game than you'd expect. But in the end, you should not be expecting something as good as the best open world games out there. Horizon, Spider-Man, and Breath of the Wild all do a way better job with this than Days Gone could hope to. Days Gone tries to combine the approaches of Horizon and Spider-Man by having a fun system of movement like Spider-Man and enemies scattered all around the world like Horizon. This is a great idea, but ends up failing from its very conception. That fun system of movement is great and all, though slightly basic, but the problem is that it ends up completely ruining the enemy idea, and they don't coexist as well as you'd think. Now that you have this bike, the zombies don't pose a threat to you since you can fairly easily get away from them. It would have been better if they used the other types of freakers like the infected bird criers and wolf runners earlier in the game and far more consistently through the open world, because then you would seriously be under a large threat. This doesn't prevent horrifying moments like a wolf leaping towards you and knocking you off your bike from happening, but it's only once you completely let your guard down that the enemies pose a threat. In Horizon, you will not easily escape these machines, but in Days Gone, riding away will easily save your skin. Of course, you do have the amazing gas mechanic, which prevents you from just riding all around, and I really do love how you have to conserve your gas, but with how much of it is available in the world sometimes, you really won't have a major issue when it comes to enemies. This is a good balance for the gas mechanic to make it fair, but it just prevents the true purpose of Days Gone being an open world game from being fulfilled even further, which is why I think this game should have either been more linear or done a better job with traversal mechanics and the threat of enemies. The thing about Days Gone's gameplay is that it is good, but really sells itself short. It tries too hard to do too many things and then forgets to do some of those things properly. It does a great job with some of these things as a basic introduction and some of them as more, but also does a bad job with other things. This is a fun game that almost never really gets that boring, so I'm sure you'll enjoy it through and through if you have a bit of patience, but don't expect something perfect or super innovative. I repeat, almost never really gets that boring. This game does do an amazing job being fun, having addicting mechanics, and a lot of the side content is brilliant, but there's one last bit of gameplay we need to talk about. Missions with these stupid, boring, and pointless flashbacks. We have many scenes where you follow a character and talk to them, but these are skippable and they're interesting enough to the point you really won't want to skip, and even the cutscenes are almost all skippable. That's great, but what isn't great is having these unskippable flashbacks that drag on and frickin' on. It's ridiculous how long some of these are, and they are incredibly boring. This is the only major slump in Days Gone's gameplay, which is quite an achievement to only have one set of slumps, but it still sucks so badly. I know they flesh out the relationship between Deacon and his wife Sarah, but, and I know this will piss a lot of people off, I don't give a flying crap about that storyline. And the story of Days Gone is really what might make or break it for you. And on my first playthrough, it nearly broke it. But now, it really does make it a lot better. I think the story here has some of the best characters out there and some of the best ideas out there. But those best ideas and characters are the ones that end the earliest. Take, for example, Ricky, Addie, Iron Mike, Lisa, and Carlos. All some of the most memorable, fun, and well-done parts of the game with incredibly emotional scenes, memorable lines, and fantastic examples of characterization. These are great and made me really interested in the narrative here. But they're only the focus for the second act of the game. The first act gets a pass, the characters are still being set up, and it doesn't do a bad job, but the third act, oh boy. During the last stretch of the game, the focus moves from the idealistic and interesting characters of Lost Lake and the heartbreaking story of exploitation shown with Lisa towards the relationship between Deacon and his wife. This is fine on paper, but the fact this storyline is so goddamn typical, boring, and not very unique whatsoever really hurts it. I love how much of the game just juggles different complex storylines that each bring proper and necessary impact to different characters, and I really do find the setup of these storylines interesting, but in the end, the connection between Deacon and Sarah remains one of the least interesting parts of this whole story. I don't really hate it, but it is the weakest part of this narrative, and sadly remains the main emphasis of the story despite this. Not to mention, the usually amazing dialogue this game has is morphed into lines so cringy in and out of context that the whole internet laughed at Days Gone with proper justification due to these storylines. The infamous line from their wedding, "You know the one I'm talking about," is one of the stupidest lines I have ever heard in a video game, no doubt about that, and I really hate that scene. The problem here is that these few lines have become now the sole representatives of Days Gone's writing, which is a shame, because outside of this, the writing is actually amazing. Tons of memorable lines that properly merge with the personalities of these distinctive characters are delivered with really well done acting all through the game, and the story will prey on your emotions quite effectively many times. Especially with that goddamn dog scene! Most of the characters are incredibly likable and fun to watch through and through, and I really love how many of them perfectly blend comedy with serious emotion. It's a really well done story when you look at these parts of it, rather than the disappointing scenes between Sarah and Deacon. I think the story really has grown on me, but that doesn't mean it's a masterpiece. It has some parts that are less memorable and more tedious, some lines that don't work, and some missions that are badly done. But if we look at the way it uses characters like Schizo to create an intense betrayal storyline, Carlos to make a disgusting and horrifying villain, and Iron Mike to give us some of the most memorable gaming quotes out there, we can really see some positive value here. Sure, the boss battles are mostly anticlimactic and way too short. Sure, there are weird bugs all over the place. Sure, there are way too many loading screens. Sure, there's a really uninteresting storyline placed front and center. Sure, the gameplay doesn't do a lot of original stuff and feels a bit basic. And sure, the game doesn't do a great job being an open world game all the time. But despite these countless imperfections, I still find myself coming back to defend Days Gone every single time. Because, one, there's an amazing soundtrack in which every song is worthy of its own montage. 2, there is incredibly well done and fun gameplay. 3, the characters and storylines outside of Sarah are great. 4, the visuals are gorgeous. 5, the side content is fantastic. And finally, the very solid acting, writing, and animation really sell everything it's trying to do and all the emotions it's trying to make you feel. And all of this saves Days Gone from being a bad game whatsoever. And in the end, I do agree with some of the critics on this, but in a different way. To them, a 6 or a 7 out of 10 is unimaginable and awful because they're way too used to giving games 8 through 10 scores. But to me, if you're able to make a 7 out of 10 game, you're doing everything right with the exception of 3 points. And that's exactly how I feel about Days Gone. A game with many faults, but more successes. A game with lots of heart and less crap. And a game with some hideous things, but more things that are beautiful. And a game that I am proud to give the more than decent score of 3.5 out of 5.
Do you know why we keep going?
No.
Because what the hell else are we gonna do?
Do you know why we want to be like them? Like the freaks. It's because they don't remember what they've lost.
You know the reason we're going to hell is we can't figure out that us is every goddamn soul that ain't walking around in shit-stained pants trying to eat us!